On Made in China 2025 and what it all means for the country's economy, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Li Xin. She is the Managing Director of Caixin Global, a Beijing-based media group providing financial and business news. Here with us in the studio is Yukon Huang. He is a Senior Fellow with the Asia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. From Edinburgh, Kristen Hopewell is a Senior Lecturer in International Political Economy at the University of Edinburgh and the author of Breaking the WTO, How Emerging Powers Disrupted the Neoliberal Project. And Jeff Moon is a China Trade and Government Affairs Specialist who served as the former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for China. Welcome to all of you to the show. Li Xin, let me start with you. So Made in China 2025, it's an ambitious plan on the part of China, $1.5 billion in investment focused on technology development. Question is, what is the primary purpose of Made in China 2025? What is China hoping to achieve here?
It's nothing new for a country to have very ambitious industrial policies. And not just China, Germany has it, and Japan has it. And China, for the last 40 years after its opening up, you can see that moves very slowly from the lower end value chain to the higher end. So it's very natural for China to try to use more aggressive industrial policies to beef up its innovation, to beef up especially the high-tech oriented industrial manufacturing. So that's the main incentive behind it. But having said that, its government policy doesn't necessarily mean a government control on the entire process. So if you look very closely into the text of the Made in China 2025, it still encourages a lot of innovation. It still encourages a better play of the market in the whole process. So I think that's to some extent, I think reading this context from the Chinese side and reading that in the English language world almost feel like you're reading two different proposals. Because in the Chinese, the focus is more on the actual effectiveness of that, and overseas, people more focusing on the measures and the fairness issue.
Right. Sometimes things get lost in translation. Kristen, looking at what China is trying to achieve here, you wrote in the Washington Post recently that China needs to move on to high-tech industries to escape the middle-income trap. Firstly, what is the middle-income trap?
So that refers to the challenge that many developing countries face. As incomes rise, it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain the kind of growth rates that are necessary to continue to develop and industrialize. So that's the situation China is faced with right now. As it was mentioned, to date, China has really concentrated on manufacturing and exporting primarily low-end, low-wage, low-value-added products, things like basic consumer goods, clothing, footwear, toys, basic electronics. But in order to continue its process of economic development, China needs to move into more high-tech, more sophisticated sectors. And that's the goal of the Made in China 2025 program.
So, Kristen, as you point out, the middle-income trap has been a challenge for many developing countries. What are the lessons that China has learned from developing countries?
Well, what we've seen in the past is that countries that have managed to develop and industrialize, countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, they've used aggressive industrial policy strategies to do that. Even countries like the U.S., many European countries, when they were going through their process of economic development back in the 1800s, the early 1900s, they used similar policies, using things like tariffs and subsidies to cultivate different industries, aggressively adopting technology for more advanced countries, and also controlling the inflow of foreign investment. So these are the types of things that China is seeking to do. With Made in China 2025 specifically, it's using government subsidies, heavy investments in research and development, local targets for manufacturing content, on top of government policies that have sought to encourage or require foreign companies operating in China to enter into joint ventures with Chinese firms and transfer technology to local Chinese companies. So that China is essentially trying to follow the example of other countries that have successfully developed by using similar industrial policies to try to do the same thing, move up the value chain and move into higher value-added industries.
Okay, let me bring it right here to our guests in the studio. Yukon, The broad Chinese goal, of course, is to grow its economy, become an innovator, become a powerful economic player in the world. It wants to become a high-income country. But here's some interesting figures from the World Bank. The World Bank estimates only 13 of the 101 middle-income countries in 1960 had become high economies by 2008. So how challenging will that be for China?
Well, it's extremely challenging. Actually, only a handful of countries have actually made it from low to middle to high-income countries out of that 13. The other group are essentially those who joined the European Union and got it by joining a much richer market. So you really have only experiences of 5 to 6 countries. And as the other speakers mentioned, those countries did it through becoming more innovative, becoming more efficient. So it's obviously clear there's nothing wrong with aspirations in terms of trying to become more innovative, more productive. I think the sensitivity, the sense that there's a sensitivity in the West, begins with the title. Because if the title had been becoming more innovative, efficient, productive, wouldn't have been an issue. But the issue made in China 2025, when you look at an American audience in the West, the first thing they're already puzzled by is, I thought everything was already made in China. So what more can they make in China? And this is, I think, you get into this issue of fairness, a sense that China may want to dominate, not just join the more innovative economies, but to dominate the more innovative economies. And I think this is where you see the friction and tension showing up.
Jeff, is that a fear in countries like the United States, that China wants to dominate rather than join other countries in developing its economy?
I think that's a large part of the concern. Yeah. Quite frankly, China is not like most other developing countries. It is now the second largest economy in the world. And there are really two concerns, I think, about this in the U.S. The first is scope and scale, and then the second is discriminatory impact. In terms of the scope, this reflects, according to the Rodian Group, 40% of China's advanced manufacturing output. And we are talking about, as the other guests have said, preferential capital, regulatory support, legislative support. And those things in other contexts have led to oversupply with regard to steel, solar panels, and in other cases. As far as discriminatory impact, a major part of the state-led economy approach towards this initiative is that China has explicitly said it wants to exclude foreign competition from its own economy and then dominate foreign sectors. And it has specific targets that it wants to capture for local firms. So, for example, in the energy or the new energy vehicles field, by 2025, that field should be 80% domestic content, and that is more than just vague guidance. When Chinese officials make those kinds of projections, they get enforced.
Point is, Jeff, if China wants to become a high-income country, if it wants to develop its economy, if it wants to become an innovator, what's wrong with that?
Nothing. Nothing wrong with wanting to be an innovator, moving up, moving into 10 different sectors that are the most promising and identifying them. I think there's a line in some of the press coverage that America is afraid that China is going to upend American dominance. I don't think that's the case. I think Silicon Valley can stand on its own and is ready to compete with pretty much anywhere. It's those other factors that I mentioned. It's the distortive effect that this will have on domestic and international trade, and that it explicitly discriminates against foreigners. That's the problem in the international trade context.
Li Xin, do you think any of these fears that the United States has on China's development is justified?
I think part of that comes from U.S. itself, and part of that comes from how China projected and depicted the story of its growth. Overall, I think U.S. never shrink away from competition. It grows on competition. And competition itself should help U.S. to further enhance its strength.
Kristen, President Trump argues that Made in China 2025 will be unfair to U.S. companies. But looking at China's intentions, as we've just outlined now, is it so unusual for China to embark on an ambitious program like this? Haven't other countries, including the United States, as you pointed out, embarked on similar plans?
Certainly, yes. So this has been Trump's big allegation, that China's trade practices are unfair, that China is unfairly disadvantaging U.S. companies and industries, and this has provided a key part of the rationale or the legitimation for Trump's trade policies and his actions against China. I think that his claim that China's trade practices are unfair are highly questionable. As you mentioned, this is something that many other countries, they've employed similar strategies to what China is doing. The reality is, although China is now the world's second largest economy, it remains a developing country. Per capita incomes, average incomes in China are just $8,000 compared to $56,000 in the U.S. So there's a huge gap between the level of development in China and the level of development in the U.S. China has seen considerable gains in generating development and reducing poverty, but it still has a long way to go and considerable challenges that it faces in trying to continue to develop and to bring incomes anywhere near the level in the U.S.
Jeff, what do you make of that China wants to close that income gap? And the other point about countries doing things in their own interests, isn't the United States now considering, for instance, restrictions on Chinese investments in sectors in the U.S. economy, which is considered not in the national security interest?
Well, I agree. If you take the average numbers, yes, the average income in China is fairly low. But China is 20% of the world population. And there are multiple economies within China. If you go to Shanghai or Beijing or Guangzhou or Chengdu, you are not in the developing world anymore. You are very much in the advanced world. And where a lot of these activities are going to happen in support of this initiative are in much more developed areas. And I think they're on par with what you see in the West.
Yukon, what is your view on this? Should the United States be concerned?
Well, I don't think the U.S. really needs to worry in the sense that China is going to be a major competitor in the most advanced technologically sophisticated industries. America has a huge advantage and gap in many of these sectors, and that's not going to be closed for decades or generations, so I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue here is this sense of fairness, and how do you describe fairness? I think the issue in terms of fairness is, from a Chinese perspective, they feel like what they're doing is being done by many countries. Right. So there's nothing really wrong with this. There's nothing wrong with the aspirations. It's essentially China's size. It's a major leading trading partner. It dominates, in terms of industrial production, many major sectors. Electronics, for example, that accounts for the bulk of this. High-speed rail, which is one of the sectors, it's a leader. Right. So the question is, in certain areas, China is quite advanced. In other areas, it's quite far behind. If the focus had been on improving efficiency and productivity, I don't think you'd have a problem. But what you see in the Made in China 2025 are targets and objectives of self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency in spirit goes against the WTO guidelines. Because if countries are self-sufficient, they won't trade with each other because they're producing everything they need. So the issue here is a few of the signals in the Made in China 2025, from a foreign perspective, is seeing it sort of going a bit too far, farther than most people would accept.
But doesn't self-sufficiency for China make sense, Yukon? I mean, if we just look at the example of that company, the Chinese company ZTE, a telecommunications manufacturer, the U.S. is trying to shut that down.
And the lesson there for China, of course, is the opposite of what U.S. would like. China says, I'm now totally dependent on the West for semiconductors and these kinds of things in my high-tech equipment. Right. Mere closure of the market means my companies are no longer viable. I need to be able to be self-sufficient. And in this particular area, it is clear. 70–80% of the global demand for semiconductors lies in China. It makes sense for China, therefore, to have a major presence. But where that presence is 70, 80, or 50, or 60% of the market, I think that's the problem. You don't need to specify the target, the goal. But it's quite logical for China to say, I need to actually have a major presence in this particular kind of activity.
Jeff?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's perfectly fine for China to develop these new activities. But if you specifically say we are out to exclude foreigners from our economy, then the comparative advantage that is the grease of the world trading system doesn't work anymore.
Li Xin, looking at it from China's point of view, how transformative is this new project, this new initiative for China? I mean, will there be less of a focus now, less of a concentration now on market-oriented industries?
Yes, of course. Like we just mentioned, some of the sectors are very market-oriented, like robotics, like the clean energy cars. So in terms of the initiative, well, in terms of the drive to develop the sectors, I think it's highly transformative. And in terms of the policy itself, there's always a gap between the policy, the actual regulation, the actual government policy to support, to implement that, and the actual result. So we actually have to wait and see the result. But in many of the sectors, I think it's highly, highly competitive, and the market is already playing a role. And speaking of that, I think a very encouraging sign is even during the US-China trade war, many of the sectors are not closing down for foreign competition. Rather, it's opening up further. One very encouraging sign is the implementation of the negative list of these industries that China have restriction to foreign investment. And that list is further shrinking by this month, by end of this month.
Right, Kristen, this is something that you've written about. One strategy that the United States is using to disrupt China's plans is to impose tariffs on on imports from China into the United States. Will these tariffs damage China's plans?
That's a good question. I think that the tariffs that Trump is imposing on China are unlikely to be effective in halting China's industrialization drive, its effort to move into these more higher value industries. But I think it will have a profoundly negative impact on U.S. manufacturing and its competitiveness. The reason for that is that the industries that China is seeking to target with Made in China 2025 are industries that are still in the process of developing. So right now, the U.S. doesn't actually import many high-tech products from China. What it primarily imports are inputs and components, parts that are used to manufacture high-tech products in the U.S. So for example, if we look at the aerospace sector, the U.S. doesn't import aircraft from China. What it imports are parts that are used to manufacture aircraft in the U.S. So the situation now with Trump's tariffs is his tariffs on high-tech goods have primarily fallen on high-tech inputs that are used to manufacture high-tech goods in the U.S. So U.S. manufacturers find themselves in a situation where they're facing tariffs on their inputs, that's raising costs, reducing their competitiveness. And at the same time, they're also facing now retaliatory tariffs from China. So that's hurting their exports to the Chinese market. So U.S. manufacturers are really finding themselves in a double whammy. On the one hand, they're facing increased costs. On the other hand, they're facing reduced access to the Chinese market. So they're really being squeezed on both sides, by the U.S. tariffs and by China's tariffs as well. So the irony here is that Trump has been claiming all along that his objective is to try to help strengthen U.S. manufacturing. But the reality we see is that his tariffs, his trade policies are actually having precisely the opposite effect. And the other issue is that I think Trump overestimates China's dependence on the U.S. market. The reality is that the U.S. only accounts for about 18% of China's exports. The vast majority of China's exports, more than 80%, go elsewhere. And China also has its own massive domestic market, the second largest economy in the world. So in terms of trying to develop its advanced industries, trying to foster this process of industrial upgrading, it's really the domestic markets that's going to provide the main basis for doing that. If we look at the aerospace sector, for example, China is rapidly emerging as the world's largest civil aviation market. So as Chinese manufacturing firms start manufacturing aircraft, they're primarily going to be looking to the domestic market as a source of sales and their means to develop by selling to the domestic Chinese market. It'll take quite some time before China is able to compete in foreign markets. And when it's ready to do so, it'll primarily be targeting initially other emerging markets before it's ready to be competitive in advanced industrialized economies. So Trump's tariff policies have little likelihood of actually impeding China's process of development, and if anything, are really just going to hurt U.S. manufacturers and undermine their competitiveness.
Jeff, what do you make of that? As Kristen points out, it's a double whammy for the United States. On the one hand, as she points out, high-tech imports here are going to hurt U.S. manufacturers, and U.S. exports are going to be more expensive.
I agree with everything she said.
Yep.
These tariffs are a lose-lose proposition, but it's important to think about what is the purpose of these tariffs. It's not tariffs for the sake of tariffs. These tariffs are being brought under a Section 301 proceeding that's well documented because the problems that are identified have not been able to be resolved through bilateral negotiations or through the WTO. With respect to forced technology transfer, for example, since 2010, the Chinese government on 8 different occasions at official meetings has formally pledged not to compel technology transfer. I've been at some of those meetings. And yet that practice continues, as everyone who does business in China knows, because of a web of regulation that's opaque and behind closed doors, verbally, companies are compelled to transfer their technology. So negotiation has been tried, it's been unsuccessful, and so I see this this tariff problem, really, it is a problem, as a last resort because there aren't other effective tools.
Li Xin, how big an issue is this technology transfer between these two countries?
I think it has been elaborated in many research papers. And I think currently the technology transfer, there is overt part and there is a more covert part of that. The covert part would be actually the seamless, collaboration between Silicon Valley and China. That many of the technology innovation actually has been done at a very, very early stage, and the companies actually are very highly integrated. So for that, it's very hard to identify whether that's technology transfer from US to China or that's collaborative in innovation. And speaking of, I want to make another point that is, speaking of the technology transfer, China is facing the same problem from the other end. As China's market more opened up and China export more, and especially invest more in the developing countries, it faced the same problem as it exported more high-end products, the high-end manufacturing goods. And in some of the developing countries, especially along the Belt and Road countries, will ask China to transfer technology to have the know-how, and also sometimes they have a very low IP protection as well. So China is facing the problem from another angle, and that would be another force to prompt it to address the issue at home.
Yukon, one other tariff issue. The U.S. has just published a list of tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. The Chinese have responded. They say they will take retaliatory steps. A foreign ministry spokesman described the U.S. action as, quote, trade bullying. Where is this leading to?
Well, of course, where it's leading to is something which is not good for either side. This is a trade war which is unnecessary. It's unproductive. There are no winners. There are no winners on the consumers, either American or Chinese. There are no winners among producers, American or Chinese. So going forward with this round of 200, plus what I would think China's retaliatory actions, which is spiraling into what I call a non-productive kind of a process. The issue goes back to what Jeff has mentioned. This is really a tactical question. The focus is really not on trade. The issue is on Made in China 2025. The issue is about unfair technology transfer. Then how do you address it? You take the issue of joint ventures. And whether joint ventures are bad, and the answer, of course, is not really. Joint ventures are common, they occur everywhere. That's not the issue. If you talk about transfers of technology among companies, when they collaborate or merge, that occurs all the time. Matter of fact, that's the daily business. One company joins another company. The issue comes, what do you share? What do you share? And technology becomes critical. So that's not even the issue. The issue is whether it is forced or not. And technically, from a Chinese perspective, there is no forced transfers, because the foreign company can always walk away. Yeah. So what is actually the issue? It's not even forced transfers. The issue is actually restricting certain activities in China so that if you want to enter, you must find a partner or you can't enter. And that, I think, is the key issue. A discussion between the US and China on the degree that these sectors should be restricted or not restricted. And I think that should be the focus of the future discussions.
Yeah, the point is, though, why use tariffs if you have other issues? Because, you know, a spokesman for the Chinese Commerce Ministry pointed out that the behavior of the US is hurting China, hurting the world, and hurting itself.
Well, I think that's absolutely correct. Tariffs are the wrong instrument to address this issue. What would be the right instrument? And that doesn't show up actually in the debate very much. It's the bilateral investment treaty, because these issues have nothing to do with trade. They actually have something to do with foreign investment. But why is it America is not actually keying in or proposing or promoting the concept of a bilateral investment treaty? Because having a treaty in the end will actually encourage more American companies to invest in China. Yeah. And if you think about the Trump policy of China, of the U.S. first, he's not actually keen on promoting foreign investment abroad. So you have the paradox. The problem actually is restrictions on U.S. investment abroad, in an administration which actually likes to promote investment at home. And that's why I think you have this kind of unproductive kind of debate.
Kristen, you say a trade war between the two countries could rapidly spiral out of control and cause immense damage to the global economy. How do you see this dispute unfolding?
Well, as we've already seen, U.S. tariffs on China have been met by retaliation on the part of China. Now Trump is escalating by planning to impose even further tariffs on an enormous scale. So we are seeing this cycle of a tit-for-tat trade war emerging. And I think it's important to remember that it's not just China that's the target of Trump's tariffs. He's been imposing tariffs on a wide range of countries around the world, many of which are among the U.S.'s closest military allies, longstanding trading partners like Canada, countries of the European Union, Japan, South Korea. So this isn't isolated to China. This is part of a larger strategy on Trump's part. It's one that really represents a change, a shift in U.S. trade policy, a move away from the multilateralism of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, towards what's really an aggressive unilateralism. The U.S. is really abandoning the rules-based system at the WTO and instead turning to the raw use of power to try to get its way. And this is, an extremely reckless and dangerous strategy that threatens to imperil the entire global economy. It's also alienating countries around the world, as I said, many of the U.S.'s traditional allies. So even though many countries share some of the U.S.'s concerns about China, about its intellectual property practices, for example, increasingly Trump is alienating those same countries. And for many countries around the world, increasingly it looks like the U.S. is the country that's behaving unfairly, that's breaking the rules, and that's the real threat to the trading system.
Okay, and that's where we have to end it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.